Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. It's a pleasure for us to be out here. Every time we're in San Francisco, I have to say, it's a very familiar feeling because, like New York, San Francisco is a city that encapsulates the old Bill Buckley adage that liberals don't care what you do so long as it's mandatory. First, before I do anything else, I want to thank Lindsay and the National Review Institute for putting on these wonderful events to celebrate, enliven, and ultimately advance the legacy of Bill Buckley. I'm, like many of you, I imagine, an old school Bill Buckley acolyte. I discovered Bill through his TV program Firing Line when I was in high school. This is back when we had VCRs. I would record episodes of Firing Line. I'd watch it religiously. I'd rewind parts of it if I didn't follow the arguments or the vocabulary very well. As you can tell, I wasn't very well-adjusted or popular teenager, but it was through Firing Line that I discovered National Review, and I ran out and I eagerly found issues of National Review. I would actually sneak them into my high school classes and put them inside the covers of my textbook and secretly read National Review during classes. What Playboy was to most teenagers my age, National Review was to me. Although if I read Playboy more carefully, I would have come across occasional contributions from Bill Buckley, including an interview, and a famous interview with Bill and Playboy, and some people were mystified or outraged by this and asked Bill, why are you lending your credibility and great name and intellect to this pornographic magazine? And Bill said, well, I have to somehow find some way to reach my son, Christopher, and it's the only way to do it. So, we've had a great proliferation of conservative opinion in journalism over the last 20 years, but there will always and forever only be one Bill Buckley. John O'Sullivan, in this regard, reminds us of an old Soviet joke where there's a region in the Soviet Union that reported to the Politburo, you won't believe the literary achievements of our region. We have 276 writers working full-time, churning out great literature. When back in the old, backwards, retrograde, czarist days, there was only one writer working in this region named Leo Tolstoy. Bill Buckley was the Leo Tolstoy of American journalism, just to get an idea of his impact and to put it in terms of contemporary or recent media figures. He was the George Will of his time, the most important conservative columnist. He was the Tim Russert of his time, the most important TV interviewer. He was the Dave Remnick of his time, the most important magazine editor. And he was the Rush Limbaugh of his time, the most important conservative popularizer, all in one. And he made conservatism incredibly appealing with his polemical brio, his winning smile, his joyous wordplay, and his high-flying lifestyle. Now, he was unapologetically highbrow. He was asked once by a friend if he wanted to go see a baseball game. He said, no thanks, I've already seen one. He did not know Oprah Winfrey's name, but once at an editorial dinner asked, who is that woman who's alternately slender and fat? That was Oprah to him. He had an abiding interest in people and an incredible gift for friendship across the ideological spectrum. Quite famously, if you wrote a letter to Bill Buckley, it didn't matter who you were, whether you're a 17-year-old out in Omaha that no one had ever heard of, he would write you back. And by some estimates, Bill Buckley wrote the most letters of any figure in American history, and he was always unabashedly himself. And one of the reasons he was such a compelling TV figure, he did all these things that you're not supposed to do on TV. You can't lean off to one side, sitting in your chair. Your tie should be straight, your hair should be combed, you can't make weird gestures with your tongue while you're talking. But he did all that and had this incredible, exotic manner and way of speaking. Chris Buckley jokes that it wasn't until he was a teenager that he was fully sure that his family was American. And of course he believed, and most importantly, in the power of ideas. And our friend Al Felsenberg has written a wonderful book about Bill, and he talks about Bill when he was editor of the Yale Daily News. And Bill was a big deal even then, and things he wrote and published got attention up and down the East Coast, and Bill spent a lot of time inveighing against the presidential campaign of Henry Wallace in 1948. Utterly no hope left-winger. Why did he spend so much time focused on him? And Al writes that Bill, his reading of history persuaded him that ideas advanced in the course of elections could outlast losing campaigns, capture the imagination of budding intellectuals, and under the right circumstances gain acceptance over time. So that's a really deep and abiding faith in ideas, and in some ways an alluring way to look at the world that I've occasionally doubted recently, in the last 2 years or so. Now, I don't want to talk much about Donald Trump this morning, but he is kind of unavoidable. Just to give you a little indication of that, I came back to my office after Thanksgiving break, and I found this brown envelope from the White House on my desk, and I was very curious what this was. I opened it up, and it was a ripped out page of one of my columns that ran in the New York Post, which I consider the nation's newspaper, and more importantly, so does the President of the United States. So this column, I wrote it after the Virginia gubernatorial election, where the Republican Ed Gillespie did everything he could to run away from Trump. Never spoke his name, didn't want Trump to endorse him, did everything he could to distance himself from Trump. Didn't work. He got shellacked anyway, and I wrote a column about how Trump is just such a dominating presence in our life. There's just no escaping him. And I thought I had quite a few trenchant observations in this column, some of which were disparaging towards the president, but that did not interest him. What focused his attention was the headline that the Post editors put on this column, which was, "There is only Trump." And Trump, in his inimitable style, had taken out a black Sharpie, circled that headline, drew a huge arrow to it, and wrote a note, "Rich, so true." Donald J. Trump. So that's pretty much how the last 2 years have gone for me. I look at these, bookshelves just groaning under all these conservative volumes of philosophy and policy, and think to myself, why did any of that matter? Because here's a guy who's going to win the Republican nomination on the sheer force of his personality and of his will. And you can say many things about Donald Trump. He is, if nothing else, quite the optimist. I have a friend who knows one of Trump's advance guys, and he had an event in Virginia during the campaign, and a typical Trump rally, the place was packed to the rafters, but Trump was in the green room. He couldn't see the size of the crowd himself. Crowd size matters to the president. So he asked this advance guy who had been out there, "How many people are here to see me?" And he says, "Sir, it's amazing. Standing room only, 5,000 people are here to see you this afternoon." Trump said, "That's amazing. 8,000 people?" And then he gets on the phone and says, "John, I'm down here in Roanoke, Virginia. You won't believe it. 10,000 people are out there waiting to hear from me." So, but in the kind of light of day, I realized I was too pessimistic when I was despairing about the power of ideas. Because if you look at, I think everyone would agree, one of the amazing accomplishments and enduring accomplishments of this administration, it's been in the realm of the judiciary, not just Supreme Court Justice Gorsuch, but the appellate court judges who will have an impact on this country for a very long time. And is this because Donald Trump has read closely on this matter and become a really abiding, deeply committed constitutionalist? Probably not. But what's happened is over the last 30 years, you had the intellectual case made for conservative constitutionalism, beginning most importantly with Antonin Scalia. Then you had the Federalist Society that sprang up to encourage conservatives in law school and create this network of conservative lawyers and judges. And what Trump has really done is move in the slipstream of all that intellectual and organizational effort and infrastructure that was created before him. I think sort of a contrary case is some of the more extravagant populism we've heard from Trump in the campaign hasn't come to fruition. And this is because Steve Bannon, sort of the avatar of this kind of politics, he shows up at the White House, and there are no populist think tanks. There's basically no populist personnel to draw on. There are no populist journals of opinion and policy. Some have sprung up now, but it's a little bit late. And there was no off-the-shelf populist agenda. So there wasn't any slipstream to operate in. Steve Bannon was just one guy, and he ended up breaking his sword very early on. Now, I do think populism is important to the party. I do think the populist noises that Trump still engages on can be very useful. They create a sort of a sense of risk and danger that has its uses, especially in foreign policy. One of my favorite headlines over the last 2 months or so is a front-page Wall Street Journal article, and the headline was, Iranian gunboats stop harassing U.S. naval ships. No one knows why. I have a guess. I have a guess. So anyway, so Steve Bannon is sort of a smoldering ruin, but against expectations, Donald Trump has had a good working relationship with the congressional leadership on his own side. Now, there are downsides to that, the omnibus last week being a very good example of that, but it's much better than the alternative, which would have been a civil war that would have served no one's purposes. Now, there have been some rocky moments. After Obamacare repeal failed to pass the Senate, there were stories about how Donald Trump was beginning privately to refer to Mitch McConnell as low energy. And if there's one thing we've learned, that's not the moniker you want in Trump's world. There was a New York Times story around this time about Trump and McConnell having an emotional phone call, and one of McConnell's guys I've known for a very long time called me up and he's trying to back down the story and says, Rich, you know that can't be true because Mitch McConnell doesn't have emotions. So anyway, they've held it together, which is important, but I think more important for our purposes and our enterprise and our cause is one of the lessons here is that in the day-to-day and hour-to-hour politics, we can get consumed by that, but that's, at the end of the day, not what's most important. That sort of politics is the weather. More important to what we do is creating a climate of ideas, creating actionable policies that are on the shelf that politicians will go to once they're in power. And it's no secret this has been a divisive time on the right, but I think it's important not to fall prey to the myth that there was ever a golden era of conservative unity. There have always been contending strands within conservatism. There's always been a fight over philosophy and over what to emphasize in our philosophy, and I think that's certainly true today, and I think we need to hash out among ourselves what is the role of populism in our movement, what do we have to offer white working class voters that will actually improve their lives, and what are the legitimate prerogatives of the nation state vis-a-vis the global market. We need to argue this out, and we need to do it in a Buckley-esque manner, which means welcoming and embracing the internal debate, having all sorts of voices across the range of that debate. Bill Buckley, his National Review, had welcomed in its pages libertarians and welcomed into its pages advocates for the old Habsburg Empire who wore lederhosen and capes to the office every day. It means being practical, no matter how disgusted or frustrated with the Republican president Bill Buckley was, he never gave into the temptation of factionalism or creating a conservative third party. And it means coming up with positive ideas of our own. Bill always realized it's not enough for liberalism to fail. Conservatism needs to succeed, which means having our own positive alternatives. And we need to do all of this always, always, always with good cheer. Because as Bill believed and said repeatedly, to despair is a sin. So I'll just leave you with one last thought, which is a passage from Bill himself, which I think is very apt in remembering Bill. Gratitude was a very important theme for him, was really at the root of his conservatism, and he gave a speech once that included this passage. To fail to experience gratitude when walking through the corridors of the Metropolitan Museum, when listening to the music of Bach or Beethoven, when exercising our freedom to speak, is to fail to recognize how much we've received from the great wellsprings of human talent and concern that gave us Shakespeare, Abraham Lincoln, Mark Twain, our parents, our friends. We need a rebirth of gratitude for those who cared for us living and mostly dead. The high moments of our way of life are their gifts to us. We must remember them in our thoughts and prayers and in our deeds. Thank you very much.